Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of the Fourth Ribbon. Chapter 1. A Quiet Death in Bloomsbury. It was the third Monday of November, one of those grey London mornings where the fog creeps not only along the pavement, but seems to climb into the very bones of the city. I had barely finished my breakfast when Holmes entered the sitting room, his overcoat still damp from the outside mist, a folded note in hand and an unreadable expression carved across his features. "Watson," he said without preamble, "put on your coat. We are summoned to Bloomsbury. A man has been found dead in a locked study. The police have already made their usual assumptions. Lestrade wishes to close the case before luncheon. We, of course, shall decline the convenience of his conclusion." I stood brushing crumbs from my lap. "Another murder?" "Not according to Scotland Yard," he replied. "They are calling it a quiet death, natural even, but I am not quite so satisfied." As we stepped outside, the city greeted us with its habitual clamour, hoofbeats lost in fog, the shout of a newspaper boy echoing like a ghost, and the soft hiss of rain against windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. The carriage ride was brief, for the address lay in Keppel Street, one of those broad yet melancholy lanes where respectable old houses now struggle to maintain their former dignity. The house in question was number 39, a pale, stately building of Georgian brick with ivy strangling its iron fence. The door was answered by a middle-aged manservant whose face bore the anxious pallor of sleepless nights. "Mr. Holmes, sir? This way, if you please." We were led through a narrow hallway adorned with aging watercolours and into the late Mr. Percy Dalrymple's study, a room that at once revealed both the man's intellect and his isolation. Books lined every wall, piled in uneven stacks across surfaces, many still bearing the dust of long neglect. Heavy curtains had been drawn across the windows, and the gaslights had been dimmed to a gentle flicker. Holmes surveyed the scene in silence. In a large leather armchair facing the hearth sat the lifeless figure of Mr. Dalrymple. His head was tilted slightly to one side, his eyes half-lidded, and his mouth partially open, as though he had expired mid-sentence. There were no visible wounds, no signs of trauma. But what captured my attention, and Holmes's, was the object lying flat upon the desk nearby. It was a ribbon, narrow, black, and stiff at the edges, as if soaked in something once liquid and now dried. It had been arranged deliberately in the shape of a loop, with a short tail trailing toward the ink blotter. I approached, noting the faint sheen of something that might have once been wet. Holmes did not speak immediately. Instead, he knelt by the chair and examined the corpse with his usual thoroughness. The fingernails, the lining of the collar, the cuffs, even the folds of the trousers. At last, he rose and turned to Inspector Lestrade, who stood at the doorway with his hands behind his back and his usual look of vague irritation. "You were quick to rule out foul play, Lestrade," Holmes said evenly. "Because there was none," the inspector replied. "No forced entry." Door was locked from the inside, window shut, latch intact, no wounds, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The man was 69, reclusive, and had a weak heart. His housekeeper says he'd been complaining of chest pain for weeks. And the ribbon? Holmes did not speak immediately. Instead, he knelt by the chair and examined the corpse with his usual thoroughness. The fingernails, the lining of the collar, the cuffs, even the folds of the trousers. At last, he rose and turned to Inspector Lestrade, who stood at the doorway with his hands behind his back and his usual look of vague irritation. "You were quick to rule out foul play, Lestrade," Holmes said evenly. "Because there was none," the inspector replied. "No forced entry." Door was locked from the inside, window shut, latch intact, no wounds, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The man was 69, reclusive, and had a weak heart. His housekeeper says he'd been complaining of chest pain for weeks. And the ribbon? Holmes then turned to the manservant who had remained quietly near the door. "Your name?" "George, sir. I've been with Mr. Dalrymple 16 years. Was your master in the habit of receiving visitors?" George shifted uncomfortably. "Very seldom. Only a handful of scholars, publishers, and once or twice a young lady from the Historical Society. But mostly he kept to himself. He would write for hours, catalogue his manuscripts, and occasionally correspond by post. And yesterday evening? Sir took supper alone at 6:30, then retired to the study as usual, said he was reviewing a new folio. I checked in once at 9. He said not to disturb him further. It wasn't until this morning, when he didn't ring for tea, that I knocked and found the door locked. Had to fetch Mr. Hooper, the locksmith from just around the corner. That's when we found him." Holmes walked to the desk and leaned over the ribbon, taking care not to touch it directly. He then opened a drawer, flicking through its contents, a stack of neatly written letters, a set of envelopes bearing foreign stamps, and a slim, leather-bound catalogue listing the volumes in Dalrymple's collection. "What of this missing manuscript?" Holmes asked, without looking up. "Missing?" Lestrade frowned. Holmes lifted the catalogue and pointed to a page. "Item 127. The Abbot's Confession, bound in calfskin 1712. It is not on the shelf, nor among the volumes on the desk, nor anywhere else in the room." Lestrade said nothing. Holmes finally turned to me. "Watson, do you observe anything curious about Mr. Dalrymple's left hand?" I examined it closely. The fingers were splayed unnaturally, and the skin bore a faint bluish tinge. "Poison?" I guessed. Holmes shook his head. "Number. But it is likely the hand was grasping something at the time of death. Something suddenly removed. That accounts for the strange position. A document, perhaps a letter. Do you believe the ribbon was meant as a message?" "Quite possibly," Holmes said, gazing at it once more. "But whose message, and to whom?" At that moment, the housekeeper, a gaunt woman in widow's black, stepped timidly into the room. "Begging your pardon, sirs, there's someone asking for you, a lady. She says it's urgent." Holmes arched a brow. "A lady?" "She wouldn't give her name, only that she must speak with the detective. She said she knew Mr. Dalrymple years ago." Holmes's expression darkened slightly, and he flicked his eyes toward Lestrade. Well, the dead do not speak, but they rarely die alone. Come, Watson, let us see what our mystery woman has to offer." And with that he swept from the room, his coat-tails billowing behind him like smoke from a snuffed flame. Chapter 2. A Locked Room and a Stolen Letter. The woman who awaited us in the drawing-room below could not have been more out of place in that faded Bloomsbury house. She was elegantly dressed in deep green wool, with a fine feathered hat, tilted just so, her gloves neatly folded in her lap. She possessed that curious composure found only in women long accustomed to moving quietly through scandalous rooms. Her features were refined but pale, and her eyes, though steady, held something of the hunted animal. "Mr. Holmes," she said at once, rising as we entered. "Thank you for seeing me. I knew Percy Dalrymple a long time ago." Holmes bowed politely. "And your name, madam?" She hesitated. "Miss Edith Larch." "Miss Larch," Holmes repeated, his tone neutral. "You were an acquaintance of the late Mr. Dalrymple?" Her lips pressed into a tight line. "I was once his fiancée, nearly 2 decades past. The engagement was broken off, not without bitterness." "And you renewed contact recently?" Number one hadn't seen or spoken to him since. "I only came today because I saw his name in the early edition of the Chronicle." The article said he had died suddenly, and it mentioned briefly that the matter was under investigation. I felt I should speak with you before you formed the wrong picture." Holmes studied her for a long moment. "And what picture would that be?" Miss Larch exhaled, eyes flickering toward the door as if weighing flight. "You must understand, Percy had enemies. In his world, book collectors, manuscript dealers. There are more jealousies and thefts than you might imagine. He was particularly secretive in his final years. Paranoid, even. I once heard from a mutual friend that he feared someone was attempting to steal something from him. A particular document, although I was never told what it contained." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Did he ever mention a manuscript titled The Abbot's Confession?" She went still. "Yes, years ago. He claimed it proved a scandal involving an aristocratic lineage. He said it was worth more than any gem." "Do you know who else might have desired it?" "Any number of people, but there was one. A man named Edward Trench, a disgraced publisher. He approached Percy years ago, shortly before he vanished from public life. I know nothing beyond that." Holmes's brows twitched at the name. "Edward Trench, that will bear inquiry." He turned slightly and gestured to me. "Watson, you'll accompany Miss Larch to her lodgings and make note of anything she may remember. I would not have her out alone after such a visit. I, meanwhile, shall examine Mr. Dalrymple's study once more. Properly, this time." By the time I returned, Holmes had dismissed both Lestrade and the constables and commandeered the room with his usual assurance. The door to the study had been locked behind him again. He opened it when I knocked, his face lit with the particular gleam he reserved for puzzles beginning to yield. "You were gone longer than expected," he said, without looking up from the floor where he crouched by the hearth. "Miss Larch proved informative. She confirms your suspicion about the manuscript's significance, as I hoped," he said. "And now allow me to return the favor." He pointed toward the desk, which was now cleared of books and papers. "You see that blotter?" I leaned in. It was worn and stained in the usual fashion, except for a fresh tear at the edge. I removed the blotting sheet. The last entry made there was a letter. Not a full draft, mind you, just a paragraph or two, but enough. He handed me the sheet, now magnified under a small glass plate. Though reversed, I could just make out the penciled indentations. "I can no longer remain silent. You must stay away from the vain girl. If any harm befalls her—" The rest trailed off into smudges. Holmes stood and stepped over to the tall bookcase nearest the desk. "Now consider, Watson. This was a man obsessed with order, yet nothing in this room is catalogued according to any consistent system, except one thing, this case." He ran his hand along the top shelf. "Every book here is dated by acquisition, but there is a gap, an absent volume precisely where the Abbot's Confession would have sat. There is also a faint indentation in the dust. So it was taken? Precisely, and here—" He pointed to a series of scratches near the lower hinge. Someone attempted to open the compartment without the key. I found the actual key wedged behind the fireplace grate. Why hide it unless someone meant to retrieve the manuscript later? Meaning someone searched for it and couldn't find it. Or, Holmes added darkly, someone found it and then murdered Dalrymple to prevent its exposure. He pulled from his coat pocket the black ribbon we had found earlier. "This, Watson, is no mere bookmark. It was dipped in a chemical compound, not ink. I detected traces of old book dye, the type once used to stain the end bands of luxury bindings in the 1700s, specifically a variant used in monastic scriptoria. The sort that might appear in the Abbot's Confession." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Indeed. The ribbon was likely part of the binding, torn off and left behind, either by mistake or design. Just then the door creaked open behind us. George, the manservant, stood pale and trembling. "Beg pardon, sirs? There's been another—" Holmes rose in one fluid motion. "Another what?" "Miss Vane, sir. The governess. She's missing." The garden behind number 39 had once been a private oasis, now choked with overgrown hedges and untended shrubs. By the time Holmes and I arrived, it had begun to drizzle, the damp leaves glistening in the dying afternoon light. We followed George's lead around the path to the small ornamental pond near the rear fence. There, among the weeds, was a shoe, and beside it, a hand. Lestrade had already arrived and stood grim-faced as two constables worked to retrieve the body from the shallows. Miss Lillian Vane, once governess to the Dalrymple household, now lay pale and limp upon the bank, her hair spread like seaweed over the wet stones. Her eyes were closed, lips parted, as if caught in mid-confession. Holmes said nothing at first. He knelt beside her, inspecting her hands, the folds of her skirt. And then he saw it, what we had both feared. Around her left wrist, loosely tied but unmistakable, was another black ribbon. "This," Holmes whispered, "has now passed the boundary of coincidence." He stood slowly, his eyes unreadable. "Two dead, a missing manuscript, and a forger turned fugitive whose name appears like a stain in the margins. This is no longer a question of curiosity, Watson." "No," I murmured. "It's murder." Holmes adjusted his coat as the drizzle sharpened into rain. "And murder," he said quietly, "has no patience for delay." Chapter 3. The Governess and the Garden Path. The rain that fell upon London that night was unrelenting, not fierce but steady, a curtain of melancholy drawn over the city's rooftops and narrow lanes. By the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, soaked to the knees and burdened with thought, midnight had come and gone. Mrs. Hudson had set a lamp in the window and left a tray of untouched tea beside the hearth. Holmes made no move toward the fire or the food. He went instead to the writing desk, where he lit the lamp, spread out his notebook, and began to write with rapid precision. I removed my coat, hung it near the stove, and sat silently waiting for him to speak. It was some time before he did. "There is a thread running through this business, Watson," he said at last without looking up. "But it has been dipped in shadow. 2 people are dead, and both were close to a missing manuscript whose very name has been forgotten by the public. The abbot's confession is the key, but the lock, I fear, lies deeper than forgery or literary rivalry." I said nothing, but poured us each a cup of tea, placing his beside the desk. Holmes paused only briefly to take a sip before resuming. "Let us return to facts. Percy Dalrymple died alone behind a locked door with no sign of struggle. He was discovered hours later. A ribbon was left behind, clearly part of something older. Miss Lillian Vane is discovered drowned, fully dressed, with no signs of forced entry into the garden. Yet the very same type of ribbon is tied around her wrist." "She was frightened," I said slowly. "You saw her expression that first evening? There was something she wasn't telling us." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. And I believe she tried to protect someone. The question is whom?" He rose suddenly and crossed to the shelves where he kept clippings and correspondence. After rifling through 2 boxes, he extracted a yellowed newspaper and laid it flat across the table. The headline, dated 5 years prior, read, "Forgery Scandal Rocks Publisher. Edward Trench vanishes after accusations." Holmes tapped the photograph printed beside the article. The image showed a man in his 30s, unsmiling, with a lean face and thinning hair. His eyes held a furtive sharpness even in grainy ink. "Edward Trench," Holmes said. "A former printer and minor publisher turned fraud. He created passable but ultimately detectable forgeries of rare volumes and sold them at considerable profit. When confronted, he vanished overnight. Scotland Yard presumed he fled abroad. I am not so certain. You think he remained in England? I think he never left London, Holmes said, and I think Miss Vane knew where he was. But why would she conceal him? Holmes was silent a long moment. Then he said, because I believe she was his sister. I started. Surely not. She never mentioned the name. She would not. Consider her position, a governess with no family, dependent on her employer's reputation. If her brother were known to be a criminal, she would never find work in respectable households. She assumed the name Vane, a name, I suspect, taken from their mother's side, and tried to bury the past. But something brought it back to the surface. Something to do with Dalrymple. I stood and walked slowly toward the window where the rain still tapped against the panes. You believe Dalrymple discovered her identity? Possibly, or perhaps more. Perhaps he located Trench himself. That would explain the warning in the blotter. He feared for the girl, and now she is dead. Holmes drew his hand through his hair and turned back to the desk. There's only one person left who may know the full truth, he said, and that is Miss Edith Larch. She claims to have come forward out of compassion, but her timing is too precise, and she knows more than she lets on. The next morning was clearer, though the streets of London remained slick with the previous day's rain. We took a cab to Miss Larch's lodgings, which proved to be a modest suite above a printer's on Great Russell Street. A narrow staircase led us to a dim landing, where she answered the door in a black shawl and pale green gloves. "Mr. Holmes," she said, composed as ever. "Dr. Watson, you honour me again." Holmes entered without a word, his eyes sweeping the room. It was sparsely furnished but neat, with a writing desk in the corner and a framed lithograph of a monastery above the fireplace. "You were engaged to Mr. Dalrymple once?" Holmes said abruptly. She blinked. "Yes." "And yet you remained in the periphery of his life, watching, but not speaking." "I was not watching." "But you were aware of the manuscript, the abbot's confession?" She hesitated. "Yes, Percy once confided its existence to me. He said it was dangerous, not because of what it revealed, but because of whom it implicated." "And did he name that person?" She looked away. "No." Holmes stepped toward the writing desk. "Miss Larch, do you know Edward Trench?" She froze. Her silence was answer enough. "I believe you do," Holmes continued calmly. "In fact, I believe you helped conceal him. You may not have approved of his actions, but you sought to protect someone he cared about, Miss Vane." Miss Larch sat down slowly, her expression taut. "She was a child when he disappeared," she said finally. "She had no knowledge of what he had done. I knew Edward only as a friend once, long before his disgrace. He begged me not to let Lillian suffer for his crimes. I agreed. That is the truth. Where is he now?" "I don't know. He sent a letter last month. No address. Only a warning that Percy Dalrymple had found something. I was afraid. That's why I came to you." Holmes considered this, then turned to me. "Watson, we must locate the letter." Miss Larch crossed to her writing desk and unlocked the centre drawer. From within, she withdrew a single folded page. Holmes took it, read it once, and passed it to me. Dalrymple has discovered the confession. He intends to publish it. He must be stopped. Lillian must not be involved. Do not try to find me. Protect her." I looked up, chilled. He signed it. Holmes gave a nod. "A foolish mistake for a fugitive." He turned back to Miss Larch. "I thank you, madam. You have done what you believe to be right, but I must find Mr. Trench. If he is innocent, he must prove it. If guilty, he must answer. As we stepped out onto the landing once more, Holmes's eyes narrowed against the rising wind. "We must move quickly," he said. "Two are already dead. A third may not be far behind." Chapter 4. The Whispered Name. It was not long after our visit to Miss Larch that the case began to stir with an urgency I had come to associate with Holmes's most taxing pursuits. Though the morning was sharp with frost and the cab wheels rattled stiffly along the paving stones, Holmes's attention never once drifted from the scrap of letter folded tightly in his gloved hand. It had not left his person since Miss Larch had surrendered it. Back at Baker Street, he examined it again under the magnifying lens, his fingers steady, his eyes unblinking. "You see here, Watson," he murmured, "the ink bleeds slightly at the edges. Not fountain pen ink. This was written with a dip pen. Commonplace enough. But notice the paper itself. Coarse, fibrous, cheap. Not the sort one buys in the West End." I bent over it. "Stationer's paper?" "Precisely. And judging by the watermark there, barely visible, we may trace it. It's marked Macaulay and Son, Shoreditch, a firm known for bulk orders and anonymity. Mr. Trench, it seems, values discretion, but not enough to elude the entire chain of supply." Before I could respond, there came a knock at the sitting-room door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a note in her hand and a worried look on her face. "This was just delivered, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. By hand, the boy said it was urgent. Holmes took it, slit the envelope with a flick of his penknife, and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you were correct. Someone watched Lillian the night she died. I found a footprint near the pond. The heel was smooth and narrow, no man's boot. I said nothing to the police. I knew they'd never listen, but I trust you might. Mary," he glanced at me. "The housemaid, she noticed more than she let on." Holmes folded the note carefully. "Come, Watson, we return to Keppel Street at once. I believe we shall find more in the garden than we did before." Mary Pritchard was waiting for us by the kitchen door, her hands red from scrubbing, her apron still damp. "I didn't tell Lestrade," she said in a hushed tone, leading us out toward the garden. He'd only scoff, but I saw something that night. After Miss Vane had gone out, I was watching from the scullery window. She was standing near the old sundial, speaking to someone, though I couldn't see who. It was too dark. "Did she seem frightened?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. Sad, I'd say, like she was pleading." "And this footprint?" Mary led us to the far side of the pond where the ground dipped slightly into the mud. There, half-shadowed by an ivy-covered statue, lay a single heel mark. Holmes knelt at once, inspecting it without touching. "Slipper heel," he said. "Narrow, tapered. Likely a woman's. And beside it, do you see?" I leaned in. There, pressed faintly into the damp earth, was a rectangular indentation, no more than a few inches long. "A box?" I guessed. "Or a book," Holmes corrected softly. "Possibly wrapped, possibly exchanged." He rose, brushing the dirt from his gloves. "Tell me, Mary, did Miss Vane ever receive any parcels? Anything by post or private courier?" Mary thought a moment. "Only once, about a week before she passed. A thin brown wrapped parcel tied with string. I thought it was a new journal. She took it straight to her room and locked the door." "Do you know what became of it?" "No, sir. I never saw it again." Holmes turned toward the house with purpose. "Take us to her room." Miss Vane's quarters were modest, but neatly kept. A dressing table with a few hairpins scattered across it, a wardrobe half empty, and a writing desk with an inkwell that had long since dried. Holmes moved quickly, tapping along the wall panels, opening drawers, lifting cushions. At last, he opened the wardrobe fully, and then paused. "Here," he said, reaching up. On the highest shelf, half buried beneath a folded shawl, lay a small black tin box. He lifted it down and opened the lid. Inside were several letters neatly tied with twine and a small bound folio, weathered, brittle, and partially water-stained. Its cover bore faded Latin script. Holmes held it with care, studying the first page. Confessio Abbatis de Holmer, 1712, he read aloud. Watson, we are holding the abbot's confession. I leaned closer. The manuscript was a series of first-hand testimonies from an unnamed monk, filled with references to secret baptisms, midnight burials, and, toward the end, a heavily redacted passage bearing the crest of a noble house. Holmes turned the final page and frowned. The last 5 leaves have been removed. He shut the folio. Someone took what they needed and left the rest. And the ribbon? I asked. He drew it from the bottom of the box, identical to the one found with Dalrymple. Holmes placed it side by side with the others. There were 4. I now have 3. That means the final one is still with the thief, or the killer. Later that afternoon, we returned to Baker Street. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during the cab ride, his hands gloved and still, his gaze on some far-off point none of us could reach. Back at our lodgings, he laid out the contents of the tin on the table. Letters, manuscript, ribbon. Now, he said quietly, comes the most dangerous stage of the investigation. The moment when the game moves from shadow to pursuit. I stirred the fire absently. Do you believe Trench has the missing pages? Holmes shook his head. Number, why believe Miss Vane gave them to someone else? Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of trust. The fact that her body was discovered not far from the exchange site suggests she was silenced after delivering them. And the most likely recipient? He rose suddenly. Is someone we've already met? I blinked. Miss Larch? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stepped to the bureau and withdrew a sealed envelope from beneath the blotter. She sent this by courier late last night, he said. Addressed to me. I had it held at the front door for security. He opened it and read aloud, Mr. Holmes, I cannot live with this any longer. I lied to you. There was more to Percy's death. There is something you must see. Come to the old chapel at Lambeth Cemetery tonight at 10 o'clock. I will bring everything. E.L. He folded the letter. A trap? I asked. Holmes nodded once, almost certainly. He checked his watch. Still, he said, we cannot afford to ignore it. The end draws close, Watson. One final ribbon remains, and I intend to be there when it is tied. Chapter 5. A letter never sent. It was a few minutes before 10 when we arrived at Lambeth Cemetery, its gates tall and iron-wrought, standing like black sentinels in the November mist. The fog that clung to the graves was thicker here, coiling around the broken stones and whispering through the bare branches like a voice half heard in a dream. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, mournful and deep. Holmes moved ahead in silence, his lantern swinging low, casting shifting shadows across the uneven path. I followed closely, hand instinctively brushing the grip of my revolver. Though I had walked into danger beside Holmes many times, the atmosphere that night was different, heavier somehow, as though we were trespassing into a place not meant for the living. She chose a dramatic venue, I whispered. Holmes did not turn. Appropriate, perhaps, for a woman burdened by secrets. The old chapel came into view through the fog, its roof partially collapsed, windows shattered, and ivy strangling its stone face. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking on the hinges as the breeze shifted. Holmes pushed it open and stepped inside, the lantern's beam cutting through the gloom. We found her waiting in the front pew. Miss Edith Larch was seated in silence, a shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders, a small parcel resting on the bench beside her. Her posture was rigid, her gaze distant. She did not move as we entered, nor did she speak. Holmes approached cautiously. "Miss Larch?" She looked up slowly. "I thought you wouldn't come." "You said you had something for me?" She nodded, then placed her hand gently on the parcel. "It's all here. The missing pages. The truth about the abbot's confession. I took them from Lillian's box before the police arrived. I knew what they were and what they could destroy." Holmes took the parcel without a word and untied the string. Inside was a folio of brittle parchment sheets, edges frayed and corners foxed with age. He leafed through them, expression unreadable. This will ruin lives," she said, quietly. "Whose lives?" I asked. She looked toward the broken altar. "The family named in the confession. The noble house to which the monk referred. A name that, even now, commands reverence in Parliament and the courts. Percy discovered it. He meant to publish it. Finally expose the scandal that had been buried for generations. But he hesitated. Perhaps he feared the consequences, or perhaps someone persuaded him to remain silent." Holmes turned another page. "And Trench?" "He believed Percy would betray him, that he would allow Lillian to suffer for her brother's crimes. I tried to mediate, but Edward was unstable, desperate. When Lillian told me she was meeting someone in the garden that night, I begged her not to go." She stopped suddenly and looked at Holmes. I was too late. There was a long pause. "You still haven't told us everything," Holmes said quietly. Miss Larch's hand trembled. "I found something. The day after Lillian died, hidden behind the fireplace in the study, a letter. I didn't tell the police. I feared what it might reveal." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Do you have it?" She reached into a handbag and withdrew a single folded page. He took it, opened it under the lantern's glow, and read, "My dear Edward, you once swore to me you would disappear, that Lillian would never know your shame. And now she is here, in my house, unknowingly entangled in a legacy not her own. I have done all I can to keep her safe. But the manuscript changes everything. If you come near her again, I will expose the truth. Consequences be damned." P.D. Holmes folded the letter. "This was written not long before Dalrymple's death." Miss Larch nodded. "He intended to send it, but never did." Holmes tucked the letter into his coat. "Which means someone else read it, someone who feared exposure." At that moment, a sound echoed from outside, the crunch of gravel beneath a slow, deliberate footstep. Holmes turned sharply, motioning for silence. I drew my revolver as another footstep followed, then a third. Someone was approaching the chapel. Holmes stepped to the doorway and flung it wide. His lantern illuminated a tall figure in a long coat, collar turned up, hat pulled low. The man froze in the light. "Edward Trench," Holmes said softly. The figure stepped forward. His face was thinner than in the newspaper photographs, more lined, but unmistakably the same man. His eyes darted between us, then settled on Edith Larch. "I came to end this," he said. Miss Larch rose, trembling. "Edward, why did you come here?" "To protect what little I have left," he replied. "But it's too late, isn't it? You gave them everything." Holmes stepped between them. "No one else needs to die, Mr. Trench. If you murdered Percy Dalrymple, I will know it. If you drowned your sister, the law will not be merciful." "I didn't kill Lillian," Trench said quickly, a sudden anguish in his voice. "I loved her. I stayed away to protect her. It wasn't until I read Percy's letter that I realized how close everything had come." He looked at the parcel in Holmes's hands. He meant to publish it. And they, whoever they were, would never allow it. Who? Holmes asked. You must name them. Trench's face darkened. He never told me directly. But I found a second letter, one he had begun to write, then burned. Only a few words remained. He threatened Lillian, said the confession must be destroyed or... And then the rest was ash. Holmes exhaled. Then we are back to the beginning. A third party, still unknown, who had both means and motive. Trench nodded slowly. I've lived in hiding long enough. If you can protect what's left of my sister's name, I'll come with you. But I beg you, don't let them twist her memory into scandal. Holmes looked to me, then back to Trench. Your sister's truth will be protected, but you must place your full trust in me. And for the first time that evening, Edward Trench's shoulders lowered, as if a weight too long borne had finally slipped from him. Later that night, in the stillness of Baker Street, Holmes laid out the recovered pages beside the black ribbons and the final letters. He stared at them a long time, unmoving, lost in calculation. We have the manuscript, he said at last. We have Trench and his testimony. But one ribbon is still missing. One truth still buried. He looked up at me, his face sharpened with focus. And whoever possesses that last ribbon, he said, holds the power to either silence history or burn the present to the ground. Chapter 6. The Book Collector's Mask. The following day dawned with a grim stillness that matched our mood precisely. Though Edward Trench remained under our informal protection, and Lestrade had been made aware of his reappearance, Holmes had asked that the man not yet be taken into custody. Not until we've retrieved the final ribbon, he had said, and Lestrade, grudgingly, had agreed. By midday, Holmes was pacing the parlour of Baker Street with the deliberate rhythm of a man pulling invisible threads together, his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes trained on the far wall as if trying to will it into speech. We must shift the perspective, Watson, he said abruptly. We have been examining this case as if Dalrymple were the centre of it all. But what if he wasn't? What if he too was being manipulated, used as a curator for something far more delicate than mere literary scandal? I looked up from the desk, where the fragments of the abbot's confession still lay spread across blotting sheets. You think he was keeping the manuscript on someone else's behalf? Not keeping, Holmes corrected, protecting. He was terrified of its contents being misused. That much is evident from the unfinished letter to Trench. But what I had failed to consider until last night is who stood to benefit from the silence surrounding the confession. Holmes walked to the window and stared out into the grey fog rolling over Baker Street. There is a single noble name mentioned in the recovered pages, he said, barely legible and partially obscured by ink and decay, but legible enough. Did you see it? I rose and moved beside him to examine the folio. Holmes pointed to a line of text near the bottom of a cracked page. Confess to me, the abbot, in the presence of the Lord Halberd. Lord Halberd? Holmes repeated. The Halberds have been a fixture in the peerage for centuries, and the current Lord Halberd is no recluse. He serves on the Board of Cultural Preservation, and he funds the British Museum's manuscript acquisitions. My eyes widened. And he would have known Dalrymple well? Indeed, they exchanged correspondence, attended auctions together, and sat on the same advisory panel for antiquities. Holmes crossed to the bureau, retrieved a slim folio of press clippings and handed it to me. Inside were 3 photographs from the Times literary supplement, taken over the past 5 years. In each one, Dalrymple appeared in the company of Lord Halberd, always at scholarly functions, always in the background, always watching. Now, Holmes said, consider this. Dalrymple begins to catalogue the abbot's confession. He realizes it implicates a noble house, possibly even Lord Halberd's own family line. He writes to Trench warning him to stay away from Lillian. Why? Because someone else has begun threatening her. Halberd, I whispered. Or someone acting on his behalf, Holmes said. A family steward, a secretary, a solicitor. It would hardly be difficult for a peer of the realm to employ quiet hands, particularly when those hands are accustomed to burying uncomfortable truths. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a calling card on a tray. Holmes read it once, then again, and gave a thin smile. "Speak of the devil," he murmured. "Lord Halberd himself. Show him in." Moments later, the man entered, a tall figure dressed immaculately in dark wool, with a silver-topped cane and a face carved from stone. Lord Halberd's presence carried the chill of influence and the practiced calm of one who never asked for permission. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "I've come regarding a matter that I suspect has already crossed your path." "Then we may save each other time," Holmes replied, motioning to the chair opposite. "You are here about the Dalrymple case and the manuscript." Halberd inclined his head. "I admire your clarity." Holmes said nothing. He waited. Halberd took a measured breath. Percy Dalrymple was a friend, a loyal friend, but in his later years he became obsessed with old wounds, family secrets, obscure texts, and the notion of legacy as a burden rather than a gift. I attempted to dissuade him from publishing the abbot's confession. He would not listen. "So you had him silenced?" Halberd's mouth tightened. "None but I am not a man who traffics in violence, but I am a man who protects what is mine. That manuscript could destroy my family, not through the actions of any living member, but through a centuries-old scandal, long dead and better buried." "Then you are aware the manuscript is no longer complete?" "I am." "And the final ribbon?" Holmes asked. Halberd hesitated. "I do not have it." Holmes stood and crossed the room slowly. "I believe you. I believe you are not the killer. But I also believe someone close to you, someone who interpreted your fear as command, acted rashly. Miss Vane is dead, Dalrymple as well, and there is one person still alive who has yet to account for their role in this." Holmes turned to me. "Fetch the catalogue, Watson." I retrieved Dalrymple's manuscript register from the sideboard. Holmes flipped it open to the final page and pointed. "Here," he said. "Item 128. On the preservation of monastic integrity, a donation. It was added the day before Dalrymple died. No auction, no receipt, no provenance. A last-minute acquisition." He turned to Halberd. "You know the name of your own family's archivist, do you not?" Halberd frowned. "Yes, Blake, Lionel Blake." Holmes smiled, not unkindly. "Then you may wish to question him." By that evening, Inspector Lestrade had acted on Holmes's deductions. Blake, the Halberd family archivist, was found attempting to leave the city with a trunk of rare volumes, including, as it turned out, the missing pages of the abbot's confession. Alongside them, tucked in a side pocket of the case, was the fourth and final ink-black ribbon. Under questioning, Blake confessed he had overheard Dalrymple's intentions to expose the Halberd name. Fearing disgrace, he took matters into his own hands. He entered the Dalrymple house by service access, confronted the scholar in his study, and when the man refused to relinquish the confession, he strangled him with the manuscript's own ribbon, tearing it from the spine to complete the act. Miss Vane, he later learned, had preserved a second set of pages. When she arranged to meet Trench in the garden, Blake followed her. And when she handed over the folio, he panicked, believing she would speak to the police. He drowned her in the pond and escaped in the fog. That night, back in the familiar warmth of Baker Street, Holmes poured a modest brandy and stared into the fire. So many threads, Watson, he murmured. Yet they all tied back to one hand, the quietest man in the library, the one who did not speak but who listened too well. He raised his glass. To ink and silence, both can kill, but neither escapes observation. Chapter 7. The Ribbon and the Ink. The case, it seemed, had reached its natural conclusion. Lionel Blake was in custody. His confession was signed, and the missing pages of the abbot's confession were returned to Scotland Yard for safekeeping. Yet for all the appearances of closure, Holmes was not at ease. He sat in his chair by the window the following morning, long after the papers had declared the mystery solved, in thick, celebratory headlines. I knew that posture well. Legs crossed, pipe held motionless between his fingers, eyes fixed not on the street outside but on something far less tangible, an equation still unsettled in the great machine of his mind. "You do not believe Blake acted alone?" I said finally. He did not look at me. Blake was the hand, yes, but not the mind. He lacked subtlety. He was desperate, careless and frightened. The ribbon was his mistake, not his signature. I leaned forward. Then who directed him? Holmes inhaled slowly through the stem of his pipe. That, my dear Watson, is the question that wakes me earlier than the sun. He rose, walking to the desk where the 4 black ribbons now lay, each preserved in its own envelope. With gloved fingers, he arranged them in sequence. The first was left beside Dalrymple, torn deliberately and placed in plain sight. The second was found on Miss Vane's wrist, tied loosely, as if to suggest symbolism. The third was discovered in her box, preserved with the manuscript. But the fourth, the one recovered from Blake's luggage, was not stained with anything at all. It had not been altered. "You mean it was uninked?" I asked. "Precisely. Which means Blake didn't create the others. He only carried the last one. He may have committed the murders, but someone else left the first 2 ribbons as messages. Someone whose hands never touched the crimes, but whose influence stained the fabric of this mystery from the start." Holmes returned to the fireplace and stood silent a long moment. "We must speak with Halberd again," he said. Lord Halberd received us that afternoon at his private chambers above the Athenaeum Club. It was a room furnished in dark woods and deeper silences. Leather-bound tomes lined the walls in neat rows, and the scent of pipe smoke hung faintly in the air, woven into the curtains like a secret. He greeted us with stiff formality, his cane propped beside the hearth, his movements deliberate. "I was under the impression," he said, "that the matter had been resolved." Holmes offered a polite smile. "The crime, yes, but not the cause." Halberd's brow twitched. "I beg your pardon." Holmes did not flinch. Blake confessed, but he did not plan the murders. He acted in fear, not foresight. That fear was born of influence, from a voice whispering that the family's secrets were sacred, that dishonor could not be permitted to surface. Halberd said nothing. His jaw set. "I believe that voice," Holmes continued, "was yours." Halberd turned toward the window. "You tread a dangerous line, Mr. Holmes." "I tread where truth leads me," Holmes replied evenly. "You never ordered a murder. I do not believe you capable of such a thing. But you did express to Blake, perhaps in vague, aristocratic phrasing, that certain things must remain hidden, and he, loyal as a dog and desperate for your favor, took it upon himself to act." The silence that followed was as thick as the drapes. At length, Halberd spoke. "You are not wrong." He did not turn. "I told him," he said quietly, "that the manuscript would bring shame to a name that had already paid enough in blood, that history should be curated with discretion, not exposed with glee. I never imagined he would interpret that as license to kill." Holmes stepped closer. He interpreted it as duty. Halberd sat heavily in the chair by the fire. Then I am guilty of pride, of arrogance, of cowardice, but not of murder? No, Holmes said, but your silence nearly cost an innocent man his life and condemned 2 others. Halbert's face hardened. So what now? Now, Holmes replied, you allow the manuscript to be preserved in full, publicly, with every name intact. Halbert looked up sharply. That would destroy what remains of the Halbert name. Better truth than the quiet rot of secrets, Holmes said. Let the weight of the past fall where it belongs. The living have carried it too long. There was a long pause. Then Halbert nodded once. Very well. We left the Athenaeum in silence, stepping once more into the fog that had become the story's ever-present curtain. Holmes was thoughtful, but not burdened. The pieces had aligned, the ribbon had been traced to its hand, and though the law would never touch Halbert, the shame of history would. Back at Baker Street, a letter was waiting. It was from Miss Edith Larch. Mr. Holmes, I have taken leave of London. My role in this affair was one of silence and inaction, and I must live with that. But I thank you for preserving Lillian's name, and for ensuring the truth found its breath before it was buried again. E.L. Holmes folded it gently. She was never guilty, I said. Just afraid. As many are, Holmes replied. We stood in silence a moment longer. Then he reached for the final ribbon, the one unstained, untouched. He held it to the light. No ink, he murmured, because the real ink was always in the words they tried to erase. Then he let the ribbon fall, like a curtain drawn on a theatre that had seen too much tragedy. Chapter 8. Holmes reveals all. The parlour at 221B Baker Street was unusually quiet that evening. No case files lay open, no correspondences scattered across the table. Only the glow of the fire lit Holmes's sharp profile as he sat unmoving, pipe resting on the arm of his chair. Outside, the fog had lifted at last, revealing a clear London sky, glazed in violet and amber, an unexpected reprieve after days of gloom. You've said nothing since we returned from Halbert's, I remarked, settling into my chair with a tumbler of brandy. Holmes gave a slight nod. That is because the case, though solved in the eyes of the law, remained unfinished in the theatre of truth. Until now. I straightened. You've discovered something further? He rose, crossed the room, and drew from the drawer the final ribbon, unstained, unused, and placed it gently upon the table beside the others. This, he said, was the only ribbon not altered. The other 3 were soaked in book dye, deliberately made to appear symbolic. The first was left at Dalrymple's desk, the second tied to Lillian Vane's wrist, the third preserved with the manuscript. And yet this final one, found in Blake's possession, was untouched. He turned to face me. That discrepancy always bothered me. Blake said he took the ribbon intending to leave a message as he had with the others. But he never did. Why? I considered the question. Perhaps he was interrupted. Unlikely. He packed carefully, fled with intent, and still failed to use it. No, Watson, the truth is simpler and darker. Blake never left the first 2 ribbons. He believed they were his idea, but they were not. I stared at him. Then who? Holmes paced slowly. Let us return to Lillian Vane. She received a parcel a week before her death, a parcel she hid in her wardrobe. Inside was the manuscript. That we know, but she never told anyone where it had come from. Why? She was protecting someone. Precisely, the person who sent her the manuscript was not Edward Trench. He feared exposure, not correspondence. No, someone else placed the manuscript in her hands, hoping she would keep it hidden, perhaps even destroy it. I stood and moved to the desk. Then the ribbon left in her box. That was not hers? Holmes gave a tight nod. Correct. It was placed there. An insurance policy. a token meant to remind her of what was at stake, a subtle threat disguised as sentiment. He turned and retrieved a sheet of notepaper from his coat pocket. "This," he said, "arrived at noon, unsigned." I took it. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, with flourishes that betrayed a classical education. It read, "She should have burned it, but she was weak. I never meant for her to die." He forced my hand, and now the hand is stained, though it never struck. You may think me monstrous, but I acted as the old families always have, with silence and survival. Let the ink dry where it may. I am finished. There was no signature, only a thin trace of lavender perfume on the page. My heart sank. "Miss Larch," I said quietly. Holmes met my gaze. Yes, but she helped us. She brought the confession. She exposed Halbert's influence. She also lied, repeatedly. She told us she hadn't seen Dalrymple in decades, when in fact they corresponded often. She claimed ignorance of Trench's location, though the letter we recovered proves otherwise. Most crucially, she had access to Dalrymple's study, to Lillian's trust, and to the manuscript. I sat slowly. So she orchestrated the entire chain of events? She manipulated it, Holmes replied. She didn't commit the murders, that was Blake. But she nudged the dominoes, all the while cloaking herself in regret and good intentions. She introduced the ribbons. She planted the idea of danger in Lillian's mind. And when events spun beyond her control, she turned to us, not out of repentance, but to ensure the outcome remained manageable. "And now she's vanished," I said, remembering her final letter. Holmes nodded. "She has disappeared to some quiet village, I expect, where the weight of history will hang upon her more than the law ever could." I was silent for a long moment. "Then no justice for Miss Vane?" "There is justice," Holmes replied, "though not the kind one sees in headlines or courtrooms. The truth is out. The manuscript will be published in full, the names exposed, the legacy confronted, and the dead, though not avenged in court, are remembered without distortion." He returned to the table and carefully gathered the 4 ribbons, sliding them into a small envelope. "And what of Trench?" I asked. "Released," Holmes said. "His name cleared. He will not return to public life, but I believe he will finally know peace." I let the brandy warm in my throat before I said, "It's a tragic story, Holmes." "All the more reason to tell it truthfully," he said. "Lies are not the only killers in this world. Silences could be just as fatal." We sat in silence after that, the fire crackling softly, the manuscript pages now resting in a bound folder on Holmes's desk, ready for submission to the British Museum. Outside, London breathed more freely beneath a clearing sky, the fog retreating into alleyways where, for once, it could do no more harm. Just before midnight, Holmes rose and crossed to the window, his silhouette cast long across the floor. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he murmured. "A ribbon, so delicate, so ordinary, and yet, in the wrong hands, it becomes a noose, a cipher, a mark of ruin." I looked at the envelope on the mantel, where the 4 black ribbons lay like the strands of a forgotten story. "And in the right hands?" I asked. Holmes turned to me. "In the right hands, Watson," he said, "it becomes evidence,